The following history lesson is intended to demonstrate that the most useful and objective understanding of taxonomy inevitably leads to a greater understanding, hence acceptance, of evolution. The ancient Semites understood that there were different kinds or sorts of larger incorporative brands of animal, but that's about as far as they could get, and they weren't even good at that. To them, the term kind was a subcategory and merely an informal way of recognizing the blatantly obvious difference between animal types. The Greek philosophers, many of whom lived before the writers of the Old Testament, were much better at classifying animals. They took note of the similarities to a deeper extent and found that there was a fluid distribution of both similarities and difference throughout life. This led to many philosophers deducing that life was a fluid dynamic of change between the species, climbing the rungs of a ladder of complexity towards humanity. The ladder, or chain of being, was one of the few great breakthroughs of philosophy that the Christian emperors kept in their otherwise violent campaigns against science and reason in their first great evangelizing missions. But they interpreted it not as the progression of the fluid dynamic of life, but as the absolute immutable hierarchy of living and non-living things, with their own additions and rearrangements to fit their beliefs, instead of the observations and conclusions of their more objective predecessors. Finally, in 1735, Swedish zoologist Carl Linnaeus rigorously examined and catalogued living things in a way that even surpassed the Greeks. He expected to find what the Church promoted, life forms with fundamentally separate archetypes reflecting separate creations. What he found was the opposite, not separate kinds of animals, but a nested hierarchy of kinds within kinds within kinds, much to the dismay of the Church. His further impiety came when he included humans within this hierarchy after determining that they were, in every sense of the word, an anthropoid, and challenged, if not pleaded someone to disprove this anti-creationist position, but none rose or could rise to the challenge. Early post-classical proponents of evolution, albeit cautiously, recognized the implications of nature's arrangement in this way, but failed to reach the ultimate conclusion as they did not have the necessary evidence. But Charles Darwin recognized that as an excellent explanatory model and one of the greatest pieces of evidence for universal common descent, and his own theory led to a more refined and accurate version of the classification of all eukaryotes. This new evolution-based classification system, known as cladistics, accounts for everything Linnaeus' system did, plus removed all of the inconsistencies of his model brought on by the more arbitrary or subjective recognition of types as a vehicle of human convenience. Creationists aren't even able to get their taxonomic thinking past or even up to the Greek philosophers of old, and have constructed a nonsensical taxonomic system known as baraminology, a pseudoscience designed to try and use a term of incorporation as a term of disparity to make it appear as if the clearly evident and distributively related groups of organisms on the planet are actually not related to one another at all. At their every attempt to construct these ancestors, which they call archaeobaramins, or more commonly as kinds, to keep it even more ambiguous, they have failed to find any distinction and even contradict each other, because they are betrayed by the fluid dynamic of universally relatedness produced by evolution. Because of the creationists' doomed burden of proof to ever distinguish the separate evolutionary bases of biodiversity, which at the very least must separate humans from species we are 98.6% genetically identical to, they try to say what they call evolutionists have the same problem in determining what a species is. However, this is further evidence to the success of evolution, as it shows the gradual developmental gradient of biodiversity that creationists claim don't exist. For example, two populations of the species POC are isolated from each other within an observable period of time, and selective pressures eventually make them separate species unable to interbreed with each other and with distinguishing traits. Even though this one species is now two distinct ones, and even though these divides may continue indefinitely through time, the laws of heredity demands that it must remain a POC, and so inevitably in the future POC cannot be considered a species but an entire incorporative group encompassing many taxonomic levels. Cladistics accounts for this fact that every descendant of a clade must remain members of the clade no matter what else or how superficially different it becomes, and only an evolutionary relationship can objectively account for this. Creationists don't deny this, obviously because they can't, and more to the point shouldn't, as this is how they make the issue of remaining the same kind seem like a sound argument, and so they instead attempt to monopolize on it and use a straw man fallacy to try and trick its followers into believing that evolution teaches the exact opposite of what it does. They then fail to realize that such potentially boundless progress has the same reverse implication, and any two extant or extinct species will always share diagnostic traits no matter how superficially different they are, and this is where creationists are unable to respond without resorting to an argument from a deceptive or unimaginative creator. Looking back at the hypothetical species family tree, a creationist would demand that because the descendants of this creature are all retraining the traits POC, then the common ancestor's lineage must also have been POC, and therefore this is always just the POC kind. However, for reasons I am about to explain, this is just as silly as future generations of human, lacking the notes of those who observed the speciation of the past, assuming the same about species POCAR. Let's say, for instance, that we look to a neighbouring continent and find two genetically isolated but reasonably close species that share the traits PO with our previous species, but lack the trait C. But however, they do share a trait Y and have their own unique traits from each other. Before we can do anything else, we can determine an objective diagnostic connection. However, we also have the benefit of using molecular evidence to establish their common genealogy, and thus conclude that they must have speciated from a common ancestor from whom they inherited their common traits with. And this is without even witnessing the speciation event. So far, we have used the information from part 1 of this series to illustrate the continuum of diversification combined with the retention of similarities, and then worked backwards to mark a few objective common ancestors. But, looking at the resulting two common ancestors, we see similarities and differences in no way greater to any of the previous divisions. In essence, these basal species are of the same basic kind of something based on common traits. Just as before, there is no way of objectively keeping these apart, especially with the multiple lines of experimentation at evolutionary biology's disposal. This is exactly how it works in the real world, with all animals, indeed all biota, belonging to clades within clades, revealing that there is no point of evolutionary disparity. In short, universal common descent. Just as the apparent expansion and cooling of the universe today leads us to the reverse implication that the universe gets smaller and hotter back through time until we reach a mathematical singularity of unknown origin, we extrapolate the exact same reverse implication with the apparent expansion of diversity and complexity of biota prevalent even in real time, and discover no sudden lack of gradient similarity that prevents what we regard today as the greatest transitions. These transitions are the topic of the final installment.